People always say that home is where the heart is, but in my experience, home is also where the biggest, most entitled headaches tend to congregate. And I'm talking about the kind of headache that comes with an HOA clipboard and a permanent scowl. My name's Elias Thorne, and I've spent 30 years as a high-level electrical systems engineer for the state, which is a fancy way of saying I know how to keep the lights on when the world tries to go dark. And believe me, I've seen some darkness. I retired to a quiet, leafy suburb called Blackwood Glen, thinking I'd finally earned the right to work on my vintage motorcycles and drink my coffee in peace, but fate, or rather a woman named Brenda, had other plans. Brenda was the president of our HOA, a woman whose personality was about as flexible as a rebar rod and twice as cold, and she decided that my existence was a personal affront to the aesthetic integrity, of the neighborhood. It started with a letter, then a fine, and then it turned into an all-out war that ended with me holding the master switch to her entire life. Though she didn't know it at the time, because see, there's a little secret about Blackwood Glen that not even the developers remembered. A secret buried in a government surplus auction 3 years ago that I happened to win. It was a Tuesday when the first envelope arrived, that crisp, white paper with the gold HOA seal that always feels like a summons to a trial you didn't know you were part of. I was out of my workshop, a custom-built, cedar-sided beauty that I'd spent 6 months perfecting, when I saw the mailman drop it off, and I just knew. The letter was signed by Brenda herself, and it claimed I was in violation of Statute 9.4 regarding, visible secondary outbuildings, and, unauthorized industrial-grade utility interfaces, I laughed. I actually stood there in the sawdust and chuckled because that workshop was hidden behind an 8-foot privacy fence and matched the shingles of my main house perfectly. But Brenda wasn't into oppos. Looking for a compromise. She was looking for a trophy, and, apparently, I was next on her list. I ignored it at first, thinking a rational person would see the permits I'd filed with the county, but Brenda isn't rational. She's a woman who once fined a neighbor for having a mailbox that was, 2 shades too jubilant, for the street's color palette. Over the next month, the letters became a flood. $100 fines turned into $500 penalties, and the tone shifted from, polite request, to, legal threat, but I just went about my business, maintaining my property, and more importantly, maintaining the small, rusted-out substation sitting on the edge of the woods just past my property line. That substation was my little retirement project, you see. When the county decommissioned the old regional grid 5 years ago, they put the hardware up for auction as scrap infrastructure, thinking it was just a pile of dead copper and porcelain. But I'd done the site surveys back in the 90s, and I knew that while the county had moved to a new digital relay system, the physical backbone for Blackwood Glen still ran through those old transformers. I bought the parcel under a private LLC for the price of used Camry, restored the cooling systems, and kept it humming, mostly because I didn't trust the new utility company to handle the surge loads during the summer. I was basically a private utility provider for 24 houses, including mine and Brenda's, but because the bills were bundled through a legacy easement agreement, no one ever looked at the name on the deed. I was the silent ghost in their wires, the man who made sure their wine fridges stayed chilled and their security gates stayed locked, and I was perfectly happy being invisible. Until the Thursday afternoon when I came home to a dead house. I pulled into the driveway and noticed the garage door wouldn't budge, so I used the manual release, walked inside, and realized the air was still, the fridge was silent, and the clock on the stove was a blank black void. My first thought was a local blackout, but then I looked out the window and saw the sprinkler system at Brenda's house across the street humming along, rainbows dancing in a mist. I walked around to my service panel, and there it was, a heavy-duty plastic tag with the HOA logo and a handwritten note. Service suspended per Enforcement Order 22B. Power will be restored upon payment of outstanding fines and removal of non-compliant structure. My blood didn't in oppos. Boyle went cold. A strange kind of clarity that only comes when you realize the person you and oppos re-dealing with has no idea how deep the hole they and oppos re-digging really is. They hadn't and oppos. Just called the utility company because the utility company wouldn't and oppos do this without a court order. Brenda had sent her husband, Gary, a man with more tools and talent, to physically pull my meter and lock the bypass. It was illegal, it was dangerous, and it was the biggest mistake of their lives. I stood there on my porch, watching Brenda pull her SUV into her driveway, and she actually had the audacity to wave at me. Not a friendly wave, but a little flick of the wrist that said, and quote, "I own you," and quote, "I didn't oppose." T waved back. I just went into my darkened kitchen, lit a single candle, and pulled out my old engineering journals. I spent the night in the quiet, listening to the neighborhood live its life while I sat in the shadows, and I realized that Brenda didn't oppose. T just wanted my workshop gone. She wanted the satisfaction of seeing me break. She'd bullied the single mom down the street into digging up her vegetable garden, and she'd forced the veteran on the corner to take down his flagpole, and she thought I was just another line item on her agenda. But as I sat there, I remembered the language of the 1994 easement contract for the Blackwood substation, a document that gave the owner, in quote, unilateral authority to conduct emergency maintenance and system-wide load balancing without prior notice in the event of grid instability, end quote. And since they had tampered with my service, they had, by definition, created, end quote, grid instability, end quote. Friday morning, I didn't oppose. T call a lawyer, and I didn't oppose. T call the police. Instead, I put on my high-vis vest, grabbed my thermal imaging camera, and headed to the substation. I spent 4 hours doing, end quote, inspections, end quote, which mostly involved logging the degradation of the primary coils that I've been meaning to service anyway. I filed a formal maintenance report with the State Utility Commission at noon, a document that legally protected me from any liability during a service interruption, and then I went to the local hardware store. I bought a new generator for myself, a quiet one, and I set it up in the middle of my yard, right where Brenda could see it. When she came out to scream about the noise, I just pointed at the tag on my meter and said, end quote, "You told me I couldn't oppose to use the grid, Brenda. I'm just following your rules," end quote. She looked like she wanted to spit, but she went back inside, probably to draft another fine, unaware that at exactly 6:01 p.m., her world was going to change. The sun was just starting to dip behind the pines when I reached for the master breaker at the substation. It's a heavy, industrial switch, the kind that requires a good bit of muscle to throw, and when it moves, you can hear the mechanical, end quote, thunk, end quote, echo through the casing. I pulled it. In an instant, the gentle hum of the neighborhood vanished. No more sprinklers, no more hum of air conditioners, no more glowing porch lights. Just a heavy, sudden silence that seemed to swallow the street whole. I walked back to my house, sat on my porch with a cold beer from my generator-powered fridge, and waited. It took about 3 minutes for the first front door to open, then another, and then there was Brenda, standing on her lawn in a silk robe, clutching her phone like a holy relic. She was frantically hitting the screen, but of course the local cell tower was on the same legacy loop, so her signal was bouncing around like a lost bird. She saw me sitting there, illuminated by my own shop lights, and she marched across the street, her face a mask of panicked rage. End quote, "Elias, what did you do? The whole block is out." End quote. I took a slow sip of my beer and looked up at her, the flickering shadows of the trees dancing across the grass. End quote. "I didn't oppose to do anything to the block, Brenda. I'm just conducting essential maintenance on my private property. There's some serious instability in the lines, probably caused by unauthorized tampering with service meters. Safety first, right?" And, quote, she froze, her eyes darting to my service panel and then back to me. End quote. "What are you talking about? Your private property? This is a utility issue." End quote. I stood up, walked to the edge of the porch, and handed her a photocopied deed. End quote. "Read the fine print, Brenda. I own the substation. I own the lines. And right now, the owner has determined that the system is too compromised to operate safely. It'll stay off until the state inspector clears the site, which, given it's a holiday weekend, might take a while." End quote. The look on her face was worth every penny I'd spent at that auction. It was a mix of pure, unadulterated shock and a dawning realization that the end quote, old man, end quote, she'd been bullying was actually the landlord of her luxury. She tried to threaten me with the HOA lawyers, but I just reminded her that the HOA has zero jurisdiction over state-registered utility infrastructure, and that her husband's little, end quote, Meter pulling and quote, stunt was currently being reviewed as a felony offense by the commission. She didn't end oppos. T have a comeback for that. She just stood there in the dark, surrounded by the silence of 20 houses that were slowly beginning to realize their Friday night plans were ruined. Over the next 48 hours, the neighborhood transformed. People who had never spoken to me before were coming by, not to complain, but to ask what was happening. When I told them the truth, that the HOA's illegal tampering had forced a safety shutdown, the tide turned so fast Brenda didn't end oppos to even have time to brace herself. By Sunday, there was a literal line of cars at the HOA office, residents demanding to know why their food was rotting in their freezers because Brenda wanted to play power games with an engineer. I stayed at the substation, documented everything, and waited for the state inspector, a guy named Miller who I'd known for 20 years. When Miller arrived, he took one look at my meter, another look at the tag Brenda had signed, and he just shook his head. And quote, Elias, you always were a magnet for the crazies, end quote, he said before writing a citation for the HOA that carried a 5-figure fine for, end quote, unauthorized interference with grid integrity, end quote. He cleared the system for restart, but only after I made it clear that any further interference would result in a permanent decommissioning of that relay, which would force the neighborhood to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to run new lines from the main city grid. Monday morning, the power came back on, but the HOA was a ghost of its former self. Brenda resigned by Tuesday afternoon, citing, end quote, health reasons, end quote, but we all knew it was because the neighbors had seen the paperwork and were preparing a class action suit for the damages to their appliances and lost food. The new board president is a soft-spoken guy named David who actually likes vegetable gardens and doesn't end oppos. Take care what color my shed door is. He came by yesterday with a box of donuts and asked if I'd be interested in a, quote, consultancy role, end quote, to help the neighborhood transition to a more modern energy setup. I told him I'd think about it, as long as I get to keep my workshop and my motorcycles exactly where they are. Looking back, it's funny how people think they can control you just because they have a title and a set of bylaws. But they forget that the world runs on something much more fundamental than rules. It runs on power, and if you don't know where yours comes from, you might just find yourself sitting in the dark. I still go out to the substation every couple of weeks, just to check the gauges and listen to the hum, and sometimes I see Brenda's husband, Gary, mowing his lawn. He doesn't end oppos. T look at me, and he definitely doesn't end oppos. T touch the meter anymore. He just mows the grass, and I sit on my porch enjoying the lights. But it makes me wonder, how many other people are out there, living in a neighborhood they think they control, never realizing that the person they're stepping on is the only one keeping their world from blinking out? It's a delicate balance, justice and electricity, and sometimes you have to be willing to flip the switch to make people see the light. What about you? Have you ever had someone try to pull the plug on your life, only to find out you were the one holding the cord? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. Let's talk about those times when the end, quote, bullies, end quote, finally met their match in the most unexpected way. Don and Oppos. T forget to hit that like button and subscribe if you want more stories from the Glen, because believe me, Brenda was and Oppos. T the only one with secrets around here.